Welcome to part 5 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at life in the South. In the post-Civil War era, if you were living in the South, this was pretty much what you had to look at if you were an African American. First of all, 90% of all African Americans lived in the South. You didn't have any of these large populations in the North yet. We haven't had things like the Great Migration yet, which we'll talk about later, right? If you're an African American living in the South, your average life expectancy was about 33 years of age, right? Not very old. Now, of course, to be fair, that's because infant mortality was so incredibly high, it drives that average down. If you made it past 33, you might make it into your 60s or 70s, but you might be hard-pressed to get there in the first place. If you're an African American in the South, you owned most likely no land, right? Because most owned zero land. In fact, 75% of them were tenant farmers. That means they were farming land that they did not own, right? Despite the efforts of the Freedmen's Bureau, they also had pretty poor education. Many of them were illiterate. Remember, back when slavery was still in place, it was actually, by the time of the Civil War, it was illegal in every southern state to teach your slave how to read. That was something that was drawn out of rebellions like the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1832, right, which made it, said, look, we can't let these guys educate themselves. So now you have the result of that. African Americans had poor education. So you have no real prospects. But, on the plus side, at least you have the vote, right? Did they really have the vote? Well, not if whites in the South could make that happen. They were always working on an effort to try and establish white supremacy, right? How close can we get things back to the way they were back when slavery was in place, to the antebellum South, right? And so when Reconstruction ended, you're going to see those black codes come back. They're not called black codes this time. This time we refer to them as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws are just post-Reconstruction black codes, if you will. And they're designed to restrict the freedom of African Americans, right? Now, Jim Crow itself, that name comes from a character in a popular minstrel show of that time period, right? But the purpose of these were to restrict these movements, the freedoms of them, and it had to do, of course, with the greatest power that African Americans had been given recently, and that was the power of the vote, right? That's the most powerful tool they'd ever been given. So how do we make it where they can't use it? Well, we'll start putting certain restrictions on it. For example, poll taxes. You want to vote, you got to pay your tax. So you show up to vote. Oh, you got your poll tax? Oh, yeah, no, I don't. Well, sorry, bud, you can't vote. So maybe next year you're a tenant farmer, you have a really good year, you come back, you got your poll tax this time, you come up. I'm here to vote. You got your poll tax? Yes, I got my poll tax. Do you have all the taxes you're owing in arrears, including last year's poll tax? It's like, what? Yeah, we'll take that for that, but sorry, you don't have this year's poll tax, sorry, you can't vote, right? That was one way. The other way was implementing literacy tests. Are you smarter than a fifth grader, right? Remember, most African Americans in the South had a pretty poor education. A lot of them were illiterate. So what do? You put a literacy test out there. And some of them had some ridiculous questions. Some of them would do things like, define this portion of the state constitution, and have this very legal speak piece of the Constitution for them to define. Now, you have poll taxes and you have literacy tests, all designed to limit the enfranchisement of African Americans. But the problem with disenfranchising African Americans through doing this is, what might you also do? Who else might you disenfranchise? Well, quite frankly, poor dumb white people. But you don't want to do that. You want them to be able to vote, because they're going to vote for the guys that you want them to vote for. How do you get them back into the fold? Well, you introduce a grandfather clause. If your grandfather could vote prior to January 1st, 1870, that's the day the 15th Amendment, suffrage for African Americans went into effect. If your grandfather could vote before January 1st, 1870, you're exempt from the literacy test or the poll taxes or any other restrictions. These grandfather clauses allowed you to get these white Southerners that you were disenfranchising through the poll taxes and literacy tests to get them back in, while still keeping African Americans disenfranchised. Did this work? Well, let me give you an example. In 1896, Louisiana held an election, and it was the last election before the implementation of the Louisiana literacy test. In that election, 130,000 African Americans voted. 2 years later, in the 1898 midterm elections, literacy tests were in place, and in that election, only 1,342 African Americans could legally vote. They managed to take out 99% of the African American voting population. I'm going to say that's pretty effective. The South is also going to originate an idea known as racial segregation, right? Florida will be the first to adopt it in 1887. They're going to adopt legal segregation, and eventually all states will do it. They're going to separate things like schools and railroad cars and bathrooms, even hospitals, drinking fountains, hotel rooms. The list goes on and on, right? Now, on the surface, you'd say, well, hold on a second. Doesn't that violate the 14th Amendment? I mean, equal protection of the law requires equal application of the law. Yeah, a lot of people thought that. Matter of fact, when people like Homer Plessy took a look at segregation, he felt this really needs to be challenged. So in 1890, Louisiana is going to pass a segregation law for its railroad cars, and Homer Plessy decides to take action. Now, there's no NAACP yet, but there are groups that can help him organize this. So on June 7th, 1892, Homer Plessy is going to purchase a ticket for the whites-only car on a short ride from New Orleans to just a little area that today is actually a suburb of New Orleans, right? Now, he's an Octoon African American, right? So he can't really go on this car. When he boards the railroad car, he announces, I am an African American, but I have purchased this ticket, and I have the right to ride in this car. And of course, he's arrested, right? He's arrested, and he's removed, and he files a lawsuit, okay? Now, the first thing that comes up, this becomes the famous case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. The first thing that comes up is, what does it take to be an African American? Because if you look at this picture here, this gentleman in this picture, that's Homer Plessy. He's black. I know when you look at that picture, you say, well, that doesn't look right. Well, remember, I said he's Octoon African American. That means he's 1/8 African American. He has an African American grandparent. Okay? So one of the questions that comes up is, what determines whether or not you are black in America? And the determination was what's called the one-drop rule. If you have anywhere in your ancestry 1 drop of African blood in you, you are African American, which, depending on how far back you want to go back, we all are, right? Because we all originate from Africa, at least the human species does. So it's kind of a weird thing, but that's where they came up with. In Plessy versus Ferguson, his challenge was that his 14th Amendment rights are being violated because he has a separate but not equal railroad car that he is relocated to, right? He says he has the right to sit and have the same accommodations as whites, okay? Unfortunately for him, he's going to lose this case, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is going to decide in 1896 in favor of Ferguson by a ruling of 8-1, right? It's going to rule that segregated railroad cars are constitutional, right? The court was under Chief Justice Melville Fuller, but the opinion was written by Henry B. Brown. And he said the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment does not invalidate segregation, that segregation is legal as long as the facilities are equal. And this is where we get the principle of separate but equal from, right? As long as they are equal. Now, Plessy's just fined $25 and spent 20 days in jail. But the repercussions of this are just, widespread, because what do they really mean by equal? Now, when you and I talk about it, we see equal as, okay, that means they are exactly the same. The waiting room have the same benches, the same lighting, the same heating, the same access to vending machines, whatever. That's not necessarily what they're saying equal is. Equal is that they both exist. They both have waiting rooms. One has electricity, one is actually outside with no electricity, or they both have railroad cars. One of them is actually a flatbed car, and the other one is a nice condition covered, accommodations. but they both have railroad cars, so that's equal. See, so we're going to have to go through this for several decades before we can finally get this turned around. States are going to immediately jump onto this after the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. For example, Alabama is going to segregate their hospitals, their mental facilities, and their elderly homes, right? They're going to pass a law making it unlawful for a white prisoner to be handcuffed or chained to an African American prisoner. They can't even be chained together in prisons. School textbooks are going to be kept in separate buildings. The same textbooks, but they can't be housed in the same buildings because one is designated for a white school and one for a black school. Marriage restrictions will be enacted in almost every state. Restaurants will be segregated. In Georgia, it'll be illegal for any all-white baseball team to play within 2 blocks of a playground designated for African Americans, right? It'll be illegal for a colored barber to serve white women to cut their hair, right? Prisons will be segregated. Ticket laws will be separated. I mean, like I said, it goes on and on and on, and we can just come up with a whole ridiculous list if we really sat down and wanted to compose it.